Transportation has always been a very important issue in Colorado. We're located in the middle of the continent and also at the base of the Rocky Mountains.
Maybe it's because of the 300 days of sunshine a year, but we've had more than our share of aviation pioneers. Aviation is huge in Colorado.
For aviators, flying across Colorado to get from the east to the west has been one of the great technical challenges of the 20th century.
Today, Colorado boasts the United States' second largest aerospace economy, but the state's aviation history had humble beginnings. Since 1909, when some teenagers began assembling a homemade monoplane. Since then, Colorado and Coloradans have soared into history. Fasten your seatbelts as Colorado Experience takes flight.
This program was generously made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
The contrails of aviation touch all of our lives. Farmers in need of a forecast, ski hills in need of tourists, mail, merchandise, meals, and of course, visits to mom. The imagination of many can-do Coloradans has transformed flights of fancy into airborne accomplishments. But Colorado was an unlikely place for an aviation mecca. The Rockies were in the way.
Without aviation, we're stuck in a backwater. Aviation makes the world a smaller place, and particularly when you live in a place like Colorado where we are in the center of the continent but kind of distant from the other big economic and social centers of the United States. People were skeptical that airplanes would ever succeed in Colorado. People felt that our altitude and our thin atmosphere simply wouldn't provide the lift that early aircraft needed in order to get over the Rocky Mountains.
In the early days of aviation, around the time of the Wright brothers, lots and lots and lots of inventors and tinkerers were experimenting with flying machines. Nobody knew what would work, nobody knew what wouldn't work.
It got so bad that in 1909, the Denver Post offered a $10,000 reward for the first designer of an airplane that would fly over the Rocky Mountains, and they weren't able to give it away.
But the friendly skies of Colorado would eventually host manned flight.
The first airplane flight in Colorado wasn't made by a Coloradan at all. There was a Frenchman, Louis Paulhan, and this was in February of 1910. This huge crowd there. All day long, they tinkered with the engine, trying to get the maximum amount of power out of it. He was not ignorant of the effects of altitude, and he knew that it would be difficult to fly at Denver's mile-high altitude. And finally, late in the afternoon, they got it going, and he took off and flew a few hundred feet straight ahead and touched down again, and the crowd went, "What? Is that all?" Quite a few of them left, but for those that remained, he flew again, and that was a much more magnificent flight. He circled the speedway several times, he went and circled the state capitol, he circled the metropolitan area, and the crowd went absolutely wild, and they broke down the barricades and they flooded the infield of the speedway, which was his landing area. And he's waving them out of the way. "Get out of the way, I need to land." And they waved and cheered. They thought it was wonderful. And finally, he had to land in a farm field adjacent to the speedway in 1911, about a year after the first flight in Colorado. Jules, John, and Frank Vandersarl were three teenage boys growing up in Denver. Their house was not far from where Coors Field is now, and they decided they were going to build an airplane. And they went about it the right way. They didn't just string some bed sheets over some wooden slats and jump off the barn roof. They wrote to France and ordered the plans for a Blériot 11. Now, a Blériot 11 in 1910 was about the most advanced airplane on the planet. There's multiple pronunciations. The French pronunciation is Blériot. Americans frequently read it phonetically as Blériot. Blériot, Blériot. You'll hear it many ways. Plans arrived, they were all in French, of course, and they didn't speak French. So they got some help with translation, and even at that, they were guessing at the meaning of a lot of the terms because it was technical French. They built their airframe, they were meticulous in their construction methods. Came time to put an engine in it, and the cost of an airplane engine was about the same cost as a house in Denver at that time. They could no way afford to buy an airplane engine, so they did what good Colorado boys would do. They designed and built their own aircraft engine. This isn't like building a lawnmower engine. It's very difficult to build something light enough to power an airplane, but powerful enough to drag it into the air. They succeeded. Then they proceeded to teach themselves to fly.
Johnny and Frankie Vandersall used to come over to our house a lot. They talked about how when they were young, they'd fly their Jenny over to Colorado Women's College, and they'd land there, and they'd pick up students and fly the girls around. They'd have them wing walking, just like the great Waldo Pepper. It was amazing to hear their stories.
A single airplane could draw huge crowds, so entrepreneurial pilots became barnstormers.
Aviation was so new. People would come out to the field where they landed. It wasn't even an airport. And generally it was just a farmer's field. And they would offer rides for a couple of dollars and just enough to make enough money to buy gasoline and go to the next field and travel the country, giving people rides.
By the 1920s, businesses were recognizing the benefits of flight, but the country was already running out of surplus World War I aircraft. A couple of filmmaking entrepreneurs, the Alexander brothers, wanted more planes than were available to buy. It was in this historic moment that innovations in flight and film collided.
The Alexander Aircraft Company began really as the Alexander Film Company, an early silent film production company. Before Hollywood consolidated, it was a silent film company that wanted to come up with a system for distributing their films. The owners of the Alexander Film Company decided that airplane travel was the fastest way to take their films from location to location. Owners of the company sent away to an airplane manufacturer asking for an order of 50 airplanes, and the manufacturer thought they were crazy. Nobody ever ordered more than 1 or 2 airplanes at a time, and so the Alexander brothers instead decided to just start building their own airplanes. They opened an airplane production facility in Inglewood at the site of the old Cinderella City and began producing their own Eagle Rock airplane.
And Alexander Aircraft very quickly became one of the major manufacturers of airplanes in the United States. And by 1929, I understand that they were making more airplanes in Colorado than any other state in the Union. The Alexander Eagle Rock was their main offering, and because it had been designed to perform well at Denver's high altitudes, when you took it to lower altitudes, it performed even better. The early airmail pilots loved it, and barnstormers loved it.
If you want to see a great example, come down to the Wings Over the Rockies Museum and just look over my shoulder. You see one of their Alexander Eagle Rock, a homegrown Colorado airplane.
Another great story that goes with the Alexander brothers and the Alexander Aircraft Company, there was this kid going to South High School who was really interested in aviation.
When the young aviation enthusiast asked his guidance counselor where he could learn to design safe airplanes, he was advised there is no such thing.
But he started hanging out down at the Alexander factory. On one occasion, they had pulled a brand new airplane out to the Inglewood airport, and he was watching them as they put the wings on and set it up. And he pointed out to the test pilot that the rigging was wrong. It was put on wrong, and it would cause a crash if the pilot tried to fly it. The pilot looked at it and he said, "You're right." So he was hired by Alexander initially to sweep up shavings in the shop, and they discovered that he was a really good draftsman. And within a couple of years, he was their chief engineer, and he designed the successful version of the Alexander Eagle Rock. His last name was Mooney, and pilots in your audience will recognize that name.
Al Mooney would earn a reputation as a designer of safe planes, but aircraft were anything but reliable when World War I broke out in 1914. It took some seriously brave pilots, some from Colorado, to climb into these wood and fabric machines to face the enemy.
Colorado's aviation history is amazing. We trace our roots back to the very beginning of aviation. In World War I in particular, the first ace ever, or first pilot ever to have 5 victories and become an ace came from Sterling, Colorado, and that's Frederick Libby. Frederick Libby was flying with the Royal Flying Corps, the British Air Service. This is prior to U.S. getting into the war. He had volunteered when he was up in Canada looking to make money in a gold rush that was going on up there, and the war broke out in August of 1914. He saw it as an opportunity to go overseas for a couple weeks and get to see Paris before the war ended. Of course, it didn't work out that way. It was a very long 4-year war, and he was there pretty much for the whole part of it.
Libby was a true Colorado cowboy turned flight jockey and war hero. He shot down an enemy plane on his first day in battle, which also happened to be the first time he ever flew in a plane or fired a machine gun. By 1917, he reportedly had 22 enemy kills to his credit. Another Colorado aviation hero would emerge between world wars, but his contribution to flight would not be with a plane or even a gun. Elrey Jeppesen would quite literally chart the course of all future aviation.
Captain Jeff, even as a young boy, would look at the birds. He said one of his first memories, about 3 years old, he remembers looking up at the birds and really being fascinated by flight. As a young boy, he would jump off the barn into a haystack with pretend wings on, thinking that maybe he could fly. Always growing up, he had flight in the back of his mind. He barely finished high school and wasn't sure what he wanted to do, but he ended up going out to the airport and trading flight lessons for sweeping and really trying to get involved with flying. He only had 2.5 hours of flight time before he soloed. And one of the favorite things that I found was a newspaper article about his first solo flight. Normally on a solo, you go up and you do 3 stop and go landings, and then you're cleared to fly solo. But he went up and he did loops and rolls. At one time, he actually came down, and they say that he thumbed his nose at his instructor, but he in fact said that he was actually just trying to get a piece of dirt out of his eye. So when I found that, I brought the article up to him and I said, "Did you really thumb your nose at your instructor?" And he just had this boy-like twinkle in his eye, and he said, "Now, do I look like the kind of guy that would thumb my nose at my instructor?"
Jeppesen began working in and around airplanes and actually spent some time working with barnstormers as a wing walker, one of these daredevil acrobats who would climb up onto the wing of a biplane and as it was flying around do different kinds of stunts, climb up and down ladders, balance on the tips of the wings. It was early form of daredeviltry. And then by the 1930s, he began working as a pilot on an airmail route. Jeppesen was working at a time when aerial charts and maps were very limited.
Airmail flying was deadly in those days. 1 in 6 airmail pilots died on the job. Their rules of employment were such that they had to fly any airplane that the Postal Service provided for them, whether it was airworthy in their opinion or not. They had to fly in all weather, and if they refused to fly, that was the end of their job. And this was the 1930s, the Great Depression, so jobs were hard to come by, especially jobs flying airplanes. And Elrey Jeppesen, in his career, said, "To save my own skin, I'm going to make a notebook and make notes on these fields that I fly into."
There wasn't a lot other than word of mouth of the topography, the weather patterns, the elevations of the different air routes that pilots were flying in the 1920s and 30s.
Back then, there were no charts. There was no guidance. They were in open cockpit airplanes in the wintertime flying over the mountain. I mean, it was really, literally uncharted territory, and they were doing it. This sense of adventure.
Most pilots, in fact, in order to navigate successfully, would literally take highway road maps, very often produced by gas stations, and follow railroad lines or roads or other landmarks.
The pilots were flying over mountain passes, and there was one winter, out of 18 pilots, 4 were killed.
And Jeppesen realized that there was a real need for up-to-date, state-of-the-art geographic information for pilots. And so purchasing a 10-cent notebook, Jeppesen began keeping his own very detailed notes of the various airplane routes.
And started making notes on the airfields that he flew into. Things like whether there were power lines along the edge of the field, that you might not see if it was foggy, which way the field drained so you'd know which side of the field was going to be dry and which one was going to be muddy. Things like whether there was fuel nearby or a telephone where you could call and get the mail transferred to a train if you couldn't take off again.
Jeppesen literally kept his notes in what he called his little black book, just a cheap notebook where he wrote down extremely detailed information about the routes that he was flying. And his little black book was so valuable to him that other pilots began asking for copies.
Initially, he made them for free. You know, he's helping save his fellow pilots' lives. It got to be such a demand, he had to draw all the notes by hand, that he said, I'm going to charge for them. So he started charging $10 a pop. And $10 was a lot of money in the Great Depression. That was the foundation of the commercial aeronautical charting industry.
Producing these maps and charts and notes became so important to other pilots that Jeppesen in time moved away from flying to produce new maps and charts full time. He was really an extraordinary information gatherer. He would literally climb to the top of hills and mountains so that he could measure their elevations. All of this in the service of making airline routes safer and more reliable for the pilots and their passenger and of course their cargo.
In World War II, Captain Jepp did not fly for his country. He drew.
He was commissioned, but he didn't really go anywhere. What happened was, when World War II came around, there were only 8 locations that were charted. So he was better used still continuing to chart the Aleutian Islands, for example, for the Navy.
And his company still exists today as Jeppesen. They're the world's leading supplier of navigation information for airlines, corporate pilots, private pilots, virtually everything that flies.
Jeppesen today makes charts for a global market. It is still considered the last word in up-to-date, accurate flight information for pilots. Jeppesen is commemorated today in the Jeppesen terminal of the Denver International Airport. If you go there today, there's a large statue of Elrey Jeppesen. Take a moment to go by and say thanks, because he's keeping you safe in the skies. He didn't get the sort of ballyhoo that a Lindbergh got, probably wasn't as famous as Admiral Byrd, but within his own community of aviators, people like Elrey Jeppesen were rock stars.
Just as Captain Jepp's charts survived him, a young man from Denver's writing survived a war that he would not.
Bert Stiles grew up in Denver, went to South High, and wanted nothing more than to be a really good writer. He was headed for a career as a very successful writer. When World War II came along, when America entered World War II, he was patriotic, like so many Americans, and joined and became a pilot for the Army Air Corps. He was a co-pilot on B-17 bombers, flew his required number of missions, and was eligible to come back to the United States and sit out the rest of the war, perhaps as an instructor. But he had always wanted to be a fighter pilot, so he retrained as a fighter pilot in P-51 Mustangs. The sad end of the story is that on one of his first missions, he followed a target into the ground and was killed. The silver lining to that is that his parents discovered that he had a completed manuscript about what it was like as a pilot on the B-17 called Serenade to the Big Bird, and they published it posthumously. It became a bestseller.
During World War II, military aviation became an increasingly important part of Colorado's economy. In the 1940s, with the opening of Lowry Air Force Base, after World War II, and particularly during the Cold War, Colorado became a central hub for military aircraft development and operations, including the development of the United States Air Force Academy and the opening of NORAD in Colorado Springs. When the Martin Company announced that they were going to open an aerospace manufacturing plant in Littleton, that was considered a very important turning point in Colorado's economy. Up until the 1950s, Colorado had relied on a mining economy and an agricultural economy, but the opening of this new aerospace production facility inaugurated the beginning of Colorado's high-tech economy.
As the aviation industry was changing, one thing was not. There were no women in the cockpit. It did not change until 1958. When a recent high school graduate working at a Denver cosmetics counter decided that she might want to be a stewardess, as the job was then called.
One of the nice ladies at the May Company had a daughter going to school in Gunnison, Colorado, Western State College. And she said, why don't you go see her and see if you like flying? And I thought it was a great idea. So I was all excited. I bought a ticket.
And then on the trip back to Denver, the pilots, as they frequently did, invited any passengers who wanted to come up in the cockpit. And she went up in the cockpit, and here out the front windows is spread the magnificent snow-capped vista of the Rocky Mountains.
I just fell in love with it. And I was 18. I was just going, talking to the pilots about flying and asking them lots of questions. But when we got back on the ground in Denver, Colorado, one of the pilots said, well, Emily, he said, if you like flying so much, why don't you take flying lessons? And you know what I said? This is 1958. I said, gee, can a girl take flying lessons? And they said, sure you can.
She was using all her savings from her job at the department store downtown, and she became a pilot and eventually became a flight instructor for Clinton Aviation in the old Stapleton.
And she became a little bit frustrated because men would come in, train for 200, 300 hours and get a job with the airlines.
And I thought, well, you know, why can't I be an airline pilot? So I started to apply in 1967. And I picked out 3 airlines. Frontier was my first choice. I kept applying and I kept updating my applications, and I did not get a response until 1973.
And she had 10 times, 20 times the amount of flying time that these male pilots had, and she couldn't even get an interview. And finally, Frontier offered her an interview. Their point of view was, get her in here, we'll put her in the simulator, she'll see that she can't do it, and that'll be that.
I was scheduled in the simulator at Frontier at 6 o'clock that very evening. So I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. And as I was waiting, a real nice thing happened. A gal came who was a receptionist at Frontier Airlines. She came over to me and she said, are you Emily Howell? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, we know you're here for an airline job, and we're all rooting for you. That just did the greatest thing for me. It just gave me a lot of confidence, and that other people knew about me and were really rooting for me.
They put her in the simulator, and she knocked their socks off.
Until Emily Howell Warner, there were no female pilots on any scheduled commercial airline.
And it was a significant breakthrough for women in aviation. But once one airline did it, and they found out that all their passengers didn't suddenly start booking other airlines because they didn't want to fly behind a woman, it became okay for airlines to hire female pilots.
Other airlines started hiring women pilots, and also the Navy and the Air Force brought women into the flight training. And so now you have women pilots in all the forces and in most of the airlines today.
Way back in the 1920s, American Airlines had hired a woman pilot. The airline union wouldn't admit her, so she couldn't fly.
Women are still in kind of the minority, but the doors have opened. We've had our first commander in space, Eileen Collins.
Emily is one of the most lovely women I know. She's strong, but not tough. She's intelligent. And I look at her really even now as the role model that I want to be as a woman pilot. Today, being a commercial airline pilot is much easier than it was back in Emily's day, for sure. But it's still challenging, and the fact that we're only 5%, we've got a lot of work to do. But I love it, and I wouldn't do anything else.
We have one of the highest per capita rates of people with pilot's licenses, second only to Alaska, I believe. The aviation industry has employed thousands and thousands of people in Colorado. Major aerospace contractors like Ball Aerospace, Lockheed Martin.
The 21st century is revealing that we're becoming a space hub.
Space travel is today where air travel was in the 1920s.
As technology develops, as Colorado continues to be a leader in developing aerospace technology, we have an excellent chance of being the pioneers who continue to push the boundaries and move aerospace technology into the 21st century and beyond. Colorado manufacturers have made their gestures to manufacturing and launching spacecraft that will orbit the Earth and possibly even go beyond. Martin Marietta today produces components for deep space probes that go as far out as human-made objects can go.
The University of Colorado has one of the best aerospace programs for research in the nation. Their aerospace engineering program is one of the top engineering programs in the nation. All of these things have attracted more and more aviation to Colorado, and aviation, I believe, is the second largest employer in Colorado and is the second largest contributor to Colorado's economy after agriculture. Forget about the ski areas there and tourism. Space travel is just making that transition now to where instead of it all being experimental and proving that it can be done, it's transitioning into space commerce and viable businesses. The space tourism business is about to take off, literally, as passenger spacecraft are going to be coming online within the next few years. Denver is in line to become a spaceport.
NASA recently announced its next class of 12 astronaut candidates, selected from over 18,000 applicants. 4 of the 12 have true ties to Colorado, including University of Denver graduate Rob Cullen. The SpaceX launch chief engineer hopes to one day fly a craft of his own design.
We're pioneers in Colorado. Whether it's in the 1920s or the 1940s or the 1950s or the 20-teens, we're still pushing the frontiers of what's possible.
Colorado brings this spirit of adventure, this feeling of what else can we do, the feeling that they could do anything, and so they do.
There's a quote from Lindbergh that kind of sums it up for me. Science, beauty, adventure, what more can you ask of life?